So now we have the spiral model. The spiral model is just that. It is a spiral. What we're doing here is we are constantly going over the same sort of areas of development over and over and over again to ensure both that we are hyper analyzing the risk, so we're analyzing it at every single step, and we're making sure that we are going and validating what we're doing as we go forward. This is a very risk oriented. We're trying to advance forward with very small steps and making sure that we have this idea of go or no go, meaning do we want to continue the project or do we want to scrap it here? It's very good for experimental ideas that you think might be possible, but you don't really know yet. So we sort of take these little steps forward and make sure that we don't go all in on it at any point. We just want to make sure that we are analyzing the situation, analyzing what we've done, and proceeding if it still is feasible and a good idea to proceed. So with the spiral model, what we do is we start in these quadrants and we move through them continually. So this is quadrant 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And what we do is we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. And what we're doing as we keep going out farther and farther is we're expanding the scope, the cost, the in-depthness of each step, the overall time we spend on it. So at the very beginning, we're creating quick prototypes. And then as we get out, it becomes slower. We look at it more. We put a little more analysis into it. We do more tests until we get to a final product at some point. So let's say we start here, right in this part, which is we're going to determine objectives, alternatives, and constraints. So here we are determining these objectives, the alternatives, the constraints. We're determining everything that the project is. We're basically coming up with a plan. From there, we move over into identifying and resolving risks. At this point, we're just pretty much identifying risks. There's nothing to really solve since we haven't coded anything. And we come up with a prototype, which in this situation is just a plan. Then we actually start executing that plan, the concept of operation. So here we may have, instead of actually coding in this initial first phase, maybe we create, class models, or maybe we sort of come up with a general idea about how the concept is going to work. And that's why this is a concept of validation. We haven't even made it into the requirements and stuff like that. We then we look at it, so we plan the next iteration. So we've come up with this concept, we've come up with this general idea of how a prototype should work, analyze the risk. Now we're gonna come up with the requirements plan and the lifecycle plan. How are we actually going to develop this? How are we going to come up with a solid set of requirements? And then we plan that, and that's our next iteration. So now we're coming around this here. Do another set of risk analysis. Is this still something that looks like it's feasible with our costs and our budget and our manpower? If so, we build that next prototype. Again, this can just be an iteration on the plan overall. It doesn't have to be an actual working prototype. It is just sort of maybe the documentation is a little thicker here. We then move on to the simulations. In this particular situation, we're doing simulations, models, or benchmarks. That's this whole area. So we're sort of just in here extending what we're doing. So in this particular loop, we're probably doing software requirements, requirement validation, things like that. We're just coming up with the general plan of it. Then we actually come up with a plan for the next phase, which is development. Move over here, do the development and the verification, do the risk analysis, do the integration, move into the next phase, do risk analysis, look at an operational prototype, so something that we can actually give to someone, do more benchmarks, testing, and then release. And this is a very, very sort of basic model. There might be a lot of loops in between these, especially during the development phase. We can make this sort of an iterative model in that sense. So here we just had a single loop where we basically coded the whole thing and then moved on, but there might be a ton of loops in there. There might be, 100 different little iterations within that development process where we're constantly checking risk and planning our next phase, constantly going over the objectives and the constraints and moving outwards from there. And this is a very, very powerful model because of that risk-focused thing. It's very good if we're, taking steps forward in a unknown area, and it's very, very adaptive. So again, it's along that idea of instead of going a straight line, we might have to move around to get to our objective. This is a great model to do that because we're constantly reevaluating what we're doing, looking at what we've done in the last cycle and coming up with a new idea for the next cycle. Now, This looks complicated, and that's because it is complicated, especially when you're designing this for a real project. It gets very complicated and it costs more to manage. You need to have a very good idea of what you're doing to keep everything in track so you don't, start off with a spiral and then just sort of like, okay, we're just going to code it and, not actually go through the testing and the implementation and the constant risk analysis. And you also need more constant stakeholder engagement. What this is, the stakeholder is like the client, the person who's paying for the software. You need their constant engagement in this. If you're going to go with the options for go or no go, which means do we continue or do we abandon the project, you're going to need their say every single loop. And if these loops are, let's say, every 5 days, maybe they're every 2 weeks even, you're going to need that stakeholder every 2 weeks to come to a meeting, sit down, learn about what you did this previous week, and then decide on whether they want to continue or not. And this can get a little bit tedious for them. So you need stakeholders which are prone to that, which want to be engaged with the project. A lot of times they don't. They just want to pay the person and have it built. They don't want to actually be involved in the day-to-day process of it. But if you have all that, Spiral model is a great model for that risk management. It's a great model for building things that need discovery where you're trying to take small steps forward.